So this session is titled Uncovering a Torah for the Anthropocene. And I'm going to get into a bit more about what that means and why we called it. But on the next slide, you're going to see the context that brings us here today. First of all, this is a session that's part of the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest, a 5-day festival happening mostly remotely for Jews to say that we care about the climate and that this matters to us and it's important for us to act on it. Today is actually Tu B'Shvat, and so Chag Sameach, and I felt like we got the noon slot on Tu B'Shvat. It feels like we're right at the peak moment of this whole festival. And I'm also here as part of the Bronfman Fellowship. I'm the deputy director for the Bronfman Fellowship. It's a program that works with young people and alumni throughout their entire lives to help promote a more pluralistic approach to the Jewish community. And the Bronfman Fellowship has been offering, this is the second of 3 sessions that we're having as part of the Jewish Climate Fest, and we feel really honored to have that part, have a part in this program. Let's move to the next slide. And why this? So title again, the Uncovering a Torah for the Anthropocene. Why are we talking about this? What brings us here today? And actually, I'm reminded now that I'm seeing Lauren and David, anyone who wants to turn their cameras on, it's lovely. It'll help me getting some reactions from folks, but if you don't want to, it's totally understandable. This is a picture of my son. He's 7 years old. This picture was taken a few months ago when we were supposed to be going grocery shopping and we absconded to go on a little nature walk at a pond nearby our house. He's quite fond of waterfowl, and so when we saw these geese, we knew we had to take a picture with them. They were very happy with us coming right up close, not too close. And when I think about climate change and the environment and where we're at today, a lot of the effort and a lot of the focus is on how do we stop climate change? How do we halt it, slow it down, protect the planet? Whether that's small individual acts like turning off the lights, recycling more, getting solar panels put on your roof, or perhaps much larger acts. Larger in the sense of addressing it from a governmental level or big corporations trying to change industries. A lot of the effort is on mitigation and slowing it down and stopping climate change, trying to help heal the planet. But there's another element that I think we need to address, and that's really what inspired me for today's session, and that is the concept of adaptation. The idea that to whatever degree there is some amount of climate change which may or may not be irreversible, but it's at least something that we're going to have to grapple with, most likely for a while. And when I think about my children and their potential children and the generations that go on from there, I think about the challenges that they might face and the planet that they're going to inherit that will either be somewhat more difficult to live in or perhaps radically and drastically more difficult to live in. And so what can we do, not only today to stop it and make it a little bit better, but what can we do to prepare them to survive in that kind of world, to be stronger, to be more successful? And for me, the place I look for that immediately is the Torah and is Jewish faith and Jewish tradition. And so when I think about what we need to survive the Anthropocene, what Judaism needs to survive, it's an interpretation of the Torah that speaks to the times that we're in today. And it's a way of being able to approach Torah with our perspective. We are, for those of you and for those of us who've studied traditional Torah study, we know what it's like to read the Torah from the lens of the 15th century, the 10th century. What about the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd centuries? And how will that interpretation change what we're looking at today? I want to add a caveat. And I promise you, this is not pure humility. I'm a layperson when it comes to all of this. I'm a layperson when it comes to some of the geology.
I really like his. How do you think I can find his?
Oh.
Yana,
if you could help mute some folks, thanks so much. I'm an amateur when it comes to understanding climate, and I'm also an amateur when it comes to Torah study. I've had a dozen years of Jewish schooling. For some of you who were on earlier, I went to Yeshiva University for my undergraduate degree. So I've studied a fair amount as a student, but I'm not a scholar. And so I welcome all of you to come and share and comment throughout this. It's going to be an open session. And these are my perspectives. And part of it is I want to acknowledge that there are many rabbis and scholars out there who are writing about this and thinking about this idea of a Torah for the 21st, 22nd century. I'm not pretending that I'm the first person who's thought of this. I'm just presenting this as my one perspective on this, and to encourage other folks who may or may not be scholars and rabbis, who may just be regular old Jews who study and think about the Torah, to come to this as well. And the last caveat I'll say, or let's go to the next slide, Yana, because we're going to talk about some terms that we're going to be using in the course of this session. So the Anthropocene. Some of you may know the term Anthropocene. Some of you may not. I may or may not be pronouncing it the way you're used to hearing it. I've heard there's a couple different ways to pronounce it. Look, it's a buzzword, and I put it in the title partly because it's a buzzword, but I think it's a helpful way to think about this. So here's the definition I found. The Anthropocene epoch is an unofficial unit of geologic time used to describe the most recent period in Earth's history when human activity has become the dominant influence on climate and the environment. So it's this time that we're living in when humans are changing the world more than anything else. Some people date this back to around 12,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture. Others would date it as recently as starting with the Industrial Revolution and the use of fossil fuels. Just to give some perspective, if you ask a geologist how old the planet is, it's about 4.5 billion years old. And if you think about epochs, I tried to look up some other epochs that you may have heard of, that I had heard of. And just one example, you have an epoch called the late Jurassic. So the Jurassic period was longer. That period had 3 different epochs in it. And the late Jurassic epoch lasted for 17 million years. So it took geologists, the smallest unit that they could break up this period into was a 17 million year period where some combination of the plant and animal life of that time led them to define the late Jurassic period. And here we are, 12,000 to 150 years into this period, and we've realized that the impact that humanity is having on the planet that we live on is so great that we need to come up with a new geological time unit. Now, obviously, it's a bit silly to talk about a Torah for the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene speaks to the period of time where human civilization thrived. The Torah, at least in terms of, in the terms that we can understand it, only exists in a relationship between God and people and humanity. Again, the values and ideas of Torah are timeless in that sense, but really when we say Torah, it's Torah as understood and read and studied by and followed by humans. So the whole Torah is an Anthropocene Torah. But what I'm getting at here is that only for the last 20 or so years since this term had been coined, do we have a realization that we're living in the Anthropocene in that way? Are people starting to appreciate that the changes that are happening in our planet are unprecedented, and that the world that we're living in may not look like the world that we remember from early in our lives or that we read about in history, and to understand the potential rapid change that we're undergoing. So that's the Anthropocene, and that's why we're studying this. And the last word of, there's no slide for this, but the last word I want to explain is just Torah. I use the word Torah to speak to all sorts of Jewish thought, whether that's the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, or the whole Hebrew Bible, or rabbinic writings. So unless I'm specific, when I talk about Torah, I pretty much mean any kind of Jewish study and Jewish thinking. Let's go to the next slide, and we're going to introduce this term that also, this is still part of the introduction, but I think it sets the stage in a really important way. There's a concept that I'm sure some of you are familiar with called Shivim Panim LeTorah, that there are 70 faces for the Torah, or facets, or ways of approaching the Torah. We can do the next slide, Yana. I was trying to think of this concept that there's 70 ways to interpret anything in the Torah. And I looked for its source. I'd heard this term hundreds of times, but I'd never looked to see where it came from. And as best as I can tell, it comes from a verse in Tehillim, in Psalms, that's then interpreted by the rabbis of the Gemara. The verse says, "God has spoken once, twice I have heard this. That strength belongs to God." Okay, so God speaks twice, and speaks once, and we hear twice. Abaye, one of the rabbinic sages, explains, one verse is stated by God, and from it emerges several explanations. So this very simple verse, which talks about one utterance of God being legitimately understood twice, you now run this through the cycle of rabbinic interpretation, a few different rounds, and we get to this phrase of shivim panim l'Torah, that there are 70 valid interpretations to Torah study and valid ways of approaching Torah study. 70 is not one of those numbers that the rabbis, I don't think, intended to mean literally explicitly. It means a lot, a whole bunch, not an infinite amount. Doesn't mean that every possible interpretation of the Torah is a valid interpretation, right? You can reject interpretations, but it means that there's room in the Beit Midrash for dozens and dozens of valid interpretations, even if they don't all jive with one another. Let's go to the next slide. A few examples of those ways of interpreting the Torah have been used quite popularly by rabbis and scholars throughout the generations. Pshat, which is the plain meaning of text. Drash, which is the moral, educational meaning of text. Remez, allegorical, metaphorical, and Sod, mystical and the hidden meaning. That's only 4. Those are the 4 most popular, and you'll find if you read, particularly biblical commentators, there are some who very much hew to a pshat interpretation of everything. They always try to read through the pshat. Others are often looking for the drash. Some people develop their styles. Not every pshat interpretation is the same. You could have 10 different pshat, or maybe not 10, but you could have a bunch of different pshat interpretations of the same Jewish idea. You could have many different drash interpretations, but these are different styles and approaches for studying Torah. I want to show you how this might live in a real verse or in a real Torah thought on the next slide, where we are exposed to the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And God tells them, eat from any fruit that you want in the garden, except for the fruit of except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, it's one of the earliest stories. It's perhaps the very first page of the first chapter of the Anthropocene, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. What is the fruit that they're eating that they're not supposed to be eating? Yes, in children's stories and in certain artwork, it's an apple. The rabbis did not think it was an apple. What did the rabbis think it was? 4 traditional interpretations came down to the fig, or a fig, grape, wheat, or an etrog, or a citron. Why is the fig the pshat interpretation? Well, the rabbis looked at it and they said, Adam and Eve covered themselves with fig leaves right afterwards. So the most simple interpretation is they were eating figs. They were by the fig tree, they ate the figs, they got in trouble, they covered themselves with the fig leaves. Simple, most basic interpretation you could come up with. What's a drash interpretation? Grapes, and I'm not saying that grapes is the only drash interpretation. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eli says that it's grapes. Why? Because good and evil, where does that come from? Grapes are a great example of that. It's a moral lesson for humans, saying that grapes can be used to create wine that's used for ritual. It can also be used to create wine that's used for drunkenness and all sorts of negative things that could come from it. So they wanted to say grapes are the way to approach this verse. The remez, the wheat, and here we get again into our Anthropocene topic. Rabbi Meir says that it was wheat. Why wheat? Wheat represents the beginning of human civilization, right? Once humans moved from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies, that's when civilization began to look like we recognize it today. And in civilizations is where the true test of how will we live together, how do we have justice, and how do we perpetrate good and evil amongst one another in community with one another. And finally, the Sod interpretation, the more mystical interpretation that's given here by Rabbi Abba, is the etrog. The etrog, which is a fruit that's used during Sukkot as a ritual object, has all sorts of mystical meanings and interpretations that its fruit is sweet and its outside is sweet. And I think that and I'm not going to get into some of the Kabbalistic interpretations of etrog and why that might have been associated with the tree of knowledge. Let's go to the next slide. David asked a question of whether I just of where the source of those categorizations come from. I can share an article I read which sort of categorized them like that. I don't want to get too caught up in the different categories of pshat, drash, remez, and sod, because it's a bit of a offshoot from where we're talking about, and I'm open to, but I'll share the link at the end of the talk if you're interested in looking at it. So what I was getting at is that there's been a very long tradition of different ways, of very valid ways of interpreting the Torah, and ways that actually that can span the whole Torah, meaning you could spend your entire life studying Torah, never run out of new things to study, and only be looking at a pshat interpretation, or only be looking at a drash interpretation, or trying to see everything through a sod or a remez. And I'd like to suggest that there are other ways as well, and that perhaps we need a new way of doing that, which would be this Torah for the Anthropocene. I found this lovely little section in Masechet Brachot, Tractate Brachot, which reads as follows. It's in a section of the Talmud that talks about the different blessings you might say on certain unique circumstances. You see a certain kind of person or a certain kind of animal or a natural event. What do you say? What blessing do you say? And so here the rabbis are discussing what blessing should one say if you see a multitude of Jews, let's say tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Jews. What blessing would you say? So one who sees a crowd of Jews should say, blessed is God, Baruch Atah Hashem, Chacham Razim, knower of secrets. Knower of secrets. That's what you should say when you see a whole bunch of Jews. Why? For their opinions are not similar one to another, and their faces are not similar to one another. So just like, even if you see hundreds of thousands of people, twins aside, no one's face is the same. Also, no one's opinions and thoughts and ideas and interpretations are the same. And so when you see enough people, such a large group of people, you actually realize that the full 70, the full shivim panim, the full range of human opinion, human thought might be represented in this group. And that the possibility that crowdsourced this group of people could possibly mine the full depths of Torah, if that's even possible, if there were any boundary to what Torah can mean, is something worth blessing and worth saying amazing things about. And so we too are, again, this is part of our mission, I think, to add to and expand the interpretations of Torah that we're going to be exploring here. Anyone? And so, Yana, you can go to the next slide. I'm going to open up, if anyone wants to ask a question at this point in general, I welcome it. And also throughout the session, you can always, as David did in the chat, you can either chat a question or write it, and I'll do my best to respond. It's easier, if someone wants to say something, it's always easier for me to respond than to try to read a comment while I'm also talking. Okay. So I hope with the Shivim Panim, I've given myself some legitimacy to propose that we have a new approach to the Torah of the Anthropocene, and we're going to jump into example number 1. What is a blessing? Right? If I were to ask my son from the first slide, what is a blessing? And when we say a blessing on food, what are we saying? He would answer to me that we're thanking God for creating food for us. And I would say, yeah, that sounds right. And that's what I would answer to my 7-year-old. But if I slowed him down a little bit more and wanted to really have a conversation about it, I would say, what is the blessing you say before you eat a sandwich? And he would know. And it's the one that I grew up singing with the song that starts, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, right? The blessing is, as I wrote it up here, blessed, Baruch Atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, blessed are you, God, who hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who brings forth bread from the land. And I would look at that and I would say, I've never seen a tree with loaves of bread hanging off of it. I've never been to a field and seen loaves of bread growing in the ground. So why on earth do we have a blessing that's phrased, hamotzi lechem min haaretz? And I'd love it. This is an open question. I'm curious to hear from everyone. Why do we think that the blessing is phrased, who brings forth bread from the land, when we all know that bread is not drawn out of the land the way that it might, the pshat interpretation of this blessing might imply? Anyone want to give a suggestion?
I will. I feel like I mean, I never thought of it until you just asked it, but I feel like it actually probably does bring our awareness back to the gratitude that we should have for the actual earth itself and the fact that our food can come from there.
Okay, so emphasizing the fact that it comes from the earth. You might forget. You go to the baker and you get the loaf of bread. You might forget that actually it comes from the planet. It comes from this miraculous process where a seed can grow into a plant and then be turned into something else. Great. Does anyone want to add on to that or share a different idea? Chai says, because we are co-creators with God, we make the raw materials. We take the raw materials God creates and make bread. That's a wonderful idea, beautiful idea. So we are and that's the idea I want to jump off of. And if you and we'll explore this a little bit more. This other section from Brachot actually is just from 2 lines after the verse we read earlier about the blessing of what happens if you see a multitude of Jews. The section of Brachot says, how much effort did Adam, the first man, Adam Harishon, exert before he found bread to eat? He plowed, sowed, reaped, sheaved, threshed, winnowed in the wind, separated the grain from the chaff, ground the grain into flour, sifted, kneaded, and baked, and only thereafter he ate. Okay, it's not simple, right? There's so much work that goes into place, but it's also a partnership with us and God, right? And so it's easy, and that's where it's like Lauren got to start it off with the fact that like when we're eating a piece of bread, you can forget where it came from. You can be so hyper focused on, okay, I've got a piece of bread in front of me. I'm just going to say a blessing to thank God. I'm saying grace, and then I can eat my food because I want to be an appreciative person. But actually, it's something deeper. It's saying we are in partnership with God in making this bread. And it's a moment, first of all, for us to maybe sit back and think about, not only am I thankful for God, I'm also thankful for the baker and the truck driver and the farmer and whoever else, the flour, I don't know how to make bread, but whatever, all the dozens and hundreds of people who might go into making a loaf of bread today, you think about that and the fact that we're all in partnership together. And it's actually, if you think about this paradigm for blessings, right, that a blessing can not only be thanking or expressing appreciation for the thing that's directly in front of us, but actually calling our attention to the fact that we're partners with God in creating the world that we're a part of. It can be applied in interesting ways to other blessings as well. So on the next slide, we're going to get into the blessings that we say in the morning upon waking up. It's a fascinating series of blessings. I love thinking about these and meditating on these. The rabbis who wrote these blessings were imagining us each morning waking up and the steps that would happen as we wake up. We wake up, we become conscious that we're alive. We open our eyes. We sit up, we stretch, we sit up. We stand up, we take our first steps, we get dressed. They were imagining all these minute steps, which could easily just be rushed through without any appreciation. And they said, we are going to write a blessing for each step along the way as someone gains their consciousness until they actually start to step out into the world or get their day started. This is what I have here on the page are just 4 of them. And we're going to explore a 5th on the next slide in just a moment. But here are 4. The rabbis imagined when you open your eyes in the morning, you say the blessing, who gives sight to the blind. When you put your clothes on, who clothes the naked. When you start to move your body, who releases the imprisoned. And when you stretch or when you stand up, I don't even know exactly which one they were imagining, who straightens the bent. And it's simple enough. We could say that every morning when you open your eyes, you are thankful that you still have vision. Thank you, God, who gives sight to the blind. But again, the same hamotzi lecha min haaretz question it begs to be asked. Am I blind when I'm sleeping? No, my eyes are closed. Okay, I could say the blessing, thank you, God, who gave me sight, right? And maybe every day it's worth thanking God for giving me sight when I was born and for sustaining it every day since then. But no, it says who gave sight to the blind. And that's where we have to think to ourselves, it's not just when I wake up in the morning and I see the world around me, I'm going to now thank God that I can still see. Maybe I have to realize that I'm in partnership with God in giving sight to the blind, and that my vision, the fact that every morning I see, should be an impetus to remind myself that I have to play a role in that as well. And so when you, whether that's literally helping people who are medically blind, or maybe it's people who are blind in other ways, people who have whose vision is limited, whose exposure to ideas is limited. Whatever we might interpret blindness, you can use as a motivation with this pasuk. I think the next one is also really beautiful. Who clothes the naked, right? Obviously, some people may sleep fully in the nude, but regardless, we have clothes, we have sheets. Most of us are not naked. We're appreciative that we have clothing. But when we wear our clothing and we say this blessing, what does it remind us? First of all, of course, we need to think about the people who might not have clothing. And how do we clothe the naked and people who might be so poor that they're at risk of not having clothes? But what does our clothing give us? It gives us human dignity. And maybe there's something we can be doing to be giving other people human dignity that we're not doing. And the fact that we're getting dressed makes us think about that. I'm not going to go through all of them, and I think you can go through all the blessings in the morning in a similar fashion. But on the next slide, we're going to look at one final one from the morning blessings. Blessed are you, God, who spreads the earth above the water. Rokah haaretz al hamayim. I think this is the one where when we first set foot on, you put your foot on the ground. Not when you take your first steps. There's a different blessing. Or maybe it's when you put your shoes on. Now I'm going to need someone to correct me. Regardless, the fact that we say this blessing, who spreads the earth above the water, is so bizarre. So bizarre. It's saying that every morning we thank God that, I guess, that geology still works. Right? That the planet hasn't flipped upside down, that we haven't been drowned. Frankly, nowadays, it's a hard blessing to say, right? Now, water is spreading over the earth in some places. Some parts of Earth are being devoid of water in ways that we really, that are becoming unsustainable. So what does it mean, who spreads the earth above the water? If we take this blessing, we reinterpret it through the Hamotzi Lechem min haaretz paradigm, and we think about it through the Anthropocene, the lens of the Anthropocene, we come to it and we say, oh my God, every morning I'm still alive on this earth. Thank God, please, every morning let me wake up and be in a part of the planet that is still sustainable and livable. And now I have to think about what partnership I have with God to keep the geology in order, to keep the planet in order. And maybe, 300 years ago, 500 years ago, when Jews were saying these blessings, they probably were able to read the blessing of who clothes the naked. And I'm sure some people, when they read that blessing, not only appreciated their own clothing, but thought about the naked people and the people who didn't have what they needed in their neighborhoods. I wonder what they were thinking about if they were able to take away a message from this blessing. And honestly, I'll tell you, this is a blessing I thought about as a teenager. I remember this because it made no sense to me. It made no sense to me why we would say this blessing. But now, with an understanding of climate the way we have it today, it seems almost too obvious. The fact that this blessing is calling on us to play a role in keeping the order of our planet together. I'm going to pause here. Are there any thoughts? I'd love to hear thoughts, comments, reactions, anything that you might have before we move on to our next example. Okay, it's a quiet crowd. I'm warning you. Example 2, I'm prepared to teach the same way I taught example 1. Example 3 is uncharted waters, and I'm expecting this group to help me think of some ways of interpreting the third text that we're going to have through the lens of the Anthropocene.
I have an idea, but I don't want to say it in case it's one of your ideas.
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. Because what you're making me think of is a sforno. Are you going to talk about a sforno, a certain sforno? Okay, good. So what you made me think of was a sforno. I remember when I taught Bereshis, when I taught the chapter of creation in Genesis in a Jewish high school. So there's one phrase that says, and I don't recall it word for word, but I could find it and then send it to the group because it's really beautiful. It's a sforno, and it says that God sent us here to this earth, la'avda u'lashamra, to work it and to sort of watch it, guard it. Yeah. And then the Sforno says, take care that you don't lekalkel es olami, that you don't destroy my world. Just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Co-creators, you know?
Yes, co-creators, and there's a lot of, you know, Lauren, you're bringing us to the fact that we made a short mention of the book of Genesis at the beginning of this talk, and it's a rich couple of chapters, the beginning of Genesis, in terms of thinking about our relationship with humanity's relationship with the land. I mean, that's where it started, and there's a lot of rich material there, and I want to thank you for sharing that, Lauren. Let's jump into example number 2. And Jan, I think you can just go straight to the next slide. This is a Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, from Ethics of Our Fathers. This is actually a part of a Mishnah, and I apologize I wanted to make it formatted well for a big screen. This is not the full Mishnah. There also are different versions of Pirkei Avot in terms of the order of the Mishnayot. So depending on which one you pick up, it may not be chapter 3, verse 7, or Mishnah 7. It might be a slightly different one. On the Sefaria.org, which is an online Jewish library, this is the way they categorize it. And I also feel just the obligation to mention that although it says Rabbi Shimon, there's another rabbi that this is attributed to. And I just want to be fair to that other rabbi. I forget his name, but it might not be Rabbi Shimon. Okay, this is when we talk about Shivim Panim LaTorah, this is a Mishnah that I've come across, and every time I read it, I get a little angry, and every time I look through all the interpretations I can find, all the rabbis, and it is not Shivim Panim LaTorah territory. If you read the rabbis' commentaries on this one, it's like 1.5 interpretations that they give pages to in their interpretations. And so I'd like to suggest I'd like to nominate this Mishnah as one that really needs a new interpretation, and I'm going to suggest one here today. Here is the Mishnah. I'm going to read it quickly. I'm going to read it in Hebrew, and then I'll read it in English, and then we'll discuss. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Hamahalech baderech v'shoneh, umafsik mimishnato ve'omer, ma na'eh ilan zeh, uma na'eh nir zeh, ma'aleh alav hakatuv, Ke'ilu mitchayev benafsho. Rabbi Shimon said, if one is studying while walking on the road and interrupts their study and says, how fine is this tree? How fine is this newly plowed field? Scripture accounts it to them as if they were mortally guilty. Okay. Does anyone want to give a pshat interpretation of what might be what is this saying? What is Rabbi Shimon talking about in the most basic sense? Yeah. Is it Chai?
Yeah, it's Chai.
Chai.
The pshat is saying you shouldn't interrupt your learning of Torah to admire nature. That it's a sin to interrupt your learning to see the beauty of the world.
Yeah, I think even to scrape away some of you've added in a little bit of a moralistic layer even on top of that. It's even saying I think the most pshat is you're not studying the Beit Midrash. You've decided to open up your Torah study while you're out in the world and walking around. And even in a situation where you're studying out in the world, don't interrupt your Torah study. So even if you're walking down the road to look up and say, "Oh, look at that." Even that is a problem, such a problem that maybe you're deserving of a death penalty. And Chai adds on a layer, which is to say, perhaps the rabbis are going out of their way to raise a concern about acknowledging the beauty around us and the world, the beauty of the world, of the natural world. Did I get that all right, Chai? Okay. Okay. So it's a problem. It can be a troubling verse to read, right? The fact that a few things. Wait, by the way, is there anything else troubling? Anything else like stand out to somebody when they read this and they say that seems off?
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
It's I mean, there's so many sources about appreciating the beauty of the world. So it definitely can't be that it's just that appreciating the beauty of the world is a problem. It's at least when I read it, it's more like what you said at first, that studying Torah is supposed to be, when you have a huge exam coming up, you're supposed to really be concentrating on studying it, not just sort of hanging out outside, part of a poetry circle,
Right. Yeah. So for sure. I mean, that one of the reasons that I think this begs a new interpretation is we know the Torah does not say that the world should not be glorified. And again, the Masechet Brachot is filled with blessings, we would say, upon seeing beautiful natural sights. So I'm not sure if the simple thing is don't ever praise the natural world, Rabbi Shimon would have a hard time with reading a few sections in Masechet Brachot where it says you should say a blessing when you see something beautiful out in the world. So right. So Lauren's saying this is about staying focused on Torah study, and and maybe Lauren's saying that what the rabbis are saying is even the natural world, which we know is so important to praise, and we love the natural world, but Torah study can't be interrupted even to say how beautiful is God's creation in that field over there, right? Is there anything else that stands out to people and they say, what's going on in this verse or in this Mishnah?
Well, just one thought about why is a person studying while they're walking around outside? And I think, for us today, studying means having a book open, but I think for the ancient rabbis, there was a lot of memorization, and, Mishnah is like repeating something. And so I think it is possible to be learning while walking, because you might not be like sitting in the Beit Midrash looking at a sefer, a book, and reading it, but you're reviewing the stuff that you've learned from memory.
Or walking around with your earpods in, listening to Daf Yomi Shir or something. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question of what are we imagining here with this person walking around studying Torah? What does that even mean? I want to draw your attention to the last few words of the Mishnah. Maleh alav hakatuv ki'ilu mitchayev benafsho. And I think this is troubling in two ways. And it's the final thing that begs, I think without that line, without these last few words, I would be satisfied with the interpretation that Lauren drew us to, which is to say, again, the Torah and the Anthropocene interpretation would be even nature, which is so glorified and deserving of glory, you shouldn't interrupt your Torah study for. Okay, it's a nice thing about Torah study while also validating nature as being above anything else. But when you read the end, it says, Maleh alav hakatuv ki'ilu mitchayev benafsho. And there's two problems with that. One is you deserve to be killed. You deserve to be killed because you distracted your Torah study. I know there are high penalties and the rabbis are trying to set a high bar for Torah study, but this is a pretty intense ending. It's a jarring ending for the way this thing starts out. And even if you want to say, yeah, you should, it's that serious to interrupt your Torah study. What is with this ma'aleh alav hakatuv ki'ilu? Again, this is where I say I'm not a scholar. Some of you on this call are. I've never seen that. I've looked to find any other language anywhere else that talks like that. It should say chayav mita. You should be sentenced to death. Or chayav mita bidei shamayim, meaning you're not actually going to be executed by your peers, but God, you're deserving of death penalty from God if it's that serious of a punishment. Ma'aleh alav hakatuv ki'ilu. So what I'm about to suggest is my interpretation, which I had suggested to me like about 10 or 15 years ago. I'm not saying that this is the only interpretation. I'm not saying that I can exactly explain how ma'aleh alav hakatuv makes more sense now, but I think it forces us to think of a different interpretation. And here's how I understand it. What Rabbi Shimon is saying is, if you're out in the world and you're living your life and you're studying your Torah and you're living your life of Torah, right? You're engaged with the world. Hamahalech baderech v'shoneh. Your daily actions are tied up very closely with your Torah study and your Torah life. Umafsik mi mishnato. And in order to appreciate the natural world around you, you think that you have to stop your Torah study. you have to somehow disconnect the Torah life that you have in order to express appreciation for the natural world, you might as well be dead. If you can't appreciate that the Torah study that you're doing is integrally tied with the natural world that you live in, what are you alive for anyway? And I think that's an interpretation that when we study Torah, it is often, or not often, I can't say that for anyone else. When I think of Torah study, I think of going into the Beit Midrash and going into, or opening up a book in a dedicated space. And if we think that to live your life thinking that Torah study is something that is sectioned off, that lives in a vacuum and isn't related to this problem of climate change, this problem of the Anthropocene and the challenges that we're facing in it, then you're missing the whole point. And your Jewish life is not going to be fulfilled, and your daily life out in the world is not going to be fulfilled. And it's as if you might as well not be living. So that's any thoughts before we move on to the next one? We have 15 minutes. I want to give us the last one to workshop together.
Maybe one comment kind of in the direction that you were pointing to is that, so if this is the line that you shouldn't be saying, what should you be saying? Because you're walking outside and you will see a beautiful tree, like it's Tu B'Shvat, maybe you'll see Ashkedia Porachat. So maybe it's about that you're mafsik mimishnato, but what you say is something of appreciation to God. What you say is, thank you, God, for, creating this amazing world, or for sustaining our natural world. And that's kind of like the bringing those two worlds together, your Mishnah and the nature that you're surrounded with.
I love that. So Renit's suggesting possibly there's another issue here, which is if you just say mana e ilan zeh, you're forgetting about the role that God plays and the relationship that God has with the natural world that we're appreciating also, right? So maybe there's an element of like, what are you saying when you're looking up and appreciating the world, and what is your relationship with nature? Maybe the reading here of mana e ilan zeh is like, oh, nice tree. Oh, that's a colorful flower, but without any sort of meaning behind it. And I think the other thing is that it's that mafsik mimishnato, is that it's the thinking that there's a break, that the sin that Rabbi Shimon is hinting at is the hafsaka, the break that you've placed between your appreciation and relationship with the natural world around you and the studying and the Torah studying that you're engaging in.
Like you're already saying Maneh Ilan Zeh. Like you're not stopping to say it. You're always saying it. It's not like, let me stop studying and say this, but like I've had that with me the whole time I've been learning.
Yeah.
I like that. I wanted to bring attention to Rav Shamshon, Raphael Hirsch, Rabbi Samson, Raphael Hirsch, in the 19 letters. I think it's section number 2 or 3. There are 19 letters in the work. And he talks about how the natural world reminds us of God's love for us. It's really, really beautiful. It's really actually just a beautiful sort of ode to the world through the lens of what exactly you're talking about.
Thank you, Lauren. And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and now David is quoting or paraphrasing Rav Kook. I'm curious if there's something going on in the air in a certain period of time that had rabbis also starting to think about that in different ways. Yeah. Okay. I think we're going to move on to our final example for this session. Okay. The 10 Commandments. I was trying to think. I was talking through this class or this study session with my wife on Sunday, and I was trying to explain to her that the idea I'm trying to get at is that this mindset or this approach of studying Torah doesn't just apply to the parts of the Torah that mention nature and the earth. Right, and I realized I'm setting myself up for failure by first bringing the bracha of Rokah haaretz al hamayim, and then we study the Mishnah about walking around in nature. I said, I think that this can be applied to anything, and so she said, "Give me an example." And I'm like, we're standing in a playground as our kids are playing, and I was like, all right, what about the 10 Commandments? Let's do it. And we started talking about it, and we came up with a few. I tried to think, what would reading the 10 Commandments through an Anthropocenic Torah lens teach us? What lessons would we walk away from it with? Now, these are paraphrased. I did not bring to you the full section of the Torah, obviously for I'm guessing many of you. This is a paraphrasing of the 10 Commandments in the way we would popularly list them. If you're not familiar with them, I apologize. But I'm curious to hear, this is where I really want to crowdsource it. Looking at these 10 Commandments, pick one. We'll start with, pick one that we'll start with. What's one that you can legitimately read an interpretation of for the Anthropocene by not negating the traditional interpretation, but by adding on to the traditional interpretation for one of these to get a meaningful message out of it?
Lo tachmod.
Okay.
Is a good start.
Yeah. So get us started with lo tachmod, with do not covet.
What's another word in English though for lo tachmod?
Like jealousy or desiring.
It's kind of like taking something that's not yours or that shouldn't be yours, or taking in quantities that you don't actually need, just because you can, just because nobody's stopping you, because nobody's watching.
Great.
I think greed is maybe the word that I'm using in my head.
And, it sounds like a combination you're giving of lo tignov and lo tachmod kind of coming together. Don't steal and don't covet, of sort of like taking and wanting and the back and forth between those two. Hi.
Yeah, and just along those same lines, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, along those same lines, not having other gods too. It could be like stuff, materialism, money. All the things that we might put ahead of God that might make us lead to coveting or stealing and creating an imbalance in the world.
That's great. I'm going to put Ariel on the spot. Ariel, who joined us, she led a great session yesterday. One of the sessions that we ran. Ariel, I'm curious. When I was thinking about this on Sunday, I went to Kabed et avicha v'et imecha, honor your father and mother, and felt like there has to be a message there about the people who've come before us on the lands that we live in. And I was wondering if you want to say something, I'm totally putting you on the spot. This is not a setup, people. We did not plan this.
No, that's awesome. I think I'm trying to do it in my art practice, in my Torah practice, in my teaching practice, of like part of how I ground in place is to think about not just my own body's presence, which I can often struggle to just be in my mind and not in my physicality and presence, but to think about my ancestors of like my biological lineage, and also chosen ancestors, and also indigenous peoples who I haven't been able to encounter because of mass genocide and erasure. So if I can root in my own Judaism and say, since I was a little kid, I've been saying, Kabed et avicha v'et imecha, what kind of a leap would it take for me to really start to picture indigenous peoples as part of like the corpus of avicha ve'imecha? And for me, being very visual and being very tactile, I would need to learn more about material culture. I would need to maybe find some photographs, find some examples of plant, so I could actually have an image in my mind or something I could smell or see. Like that's how I would start to engage that as a practice, maybe.
I love that. And I think, and if you, and understanding the generations that came before us, I love that the ancestors, our actual ancestors and the ancestors of, I forget actually exactly how you said it, but I'll say the ancestors of choice, the people we choose to think of as our ancestors, and thinking about maybe how they how they interacted with the planet. And that a way to kabed et avicha v'et imecha is actually to honor how not necessarily our actual ancestors, our actual parents, but maybe our ancestors or the people who lived at the time of our ancestors thought about a relationship between humans and the planet, is also another way of honoring those who came before us, honoring our ancestors. In the last couple minutes, anyone want to take another stab or share another idea?
I'll add that I think you can't zachor et Yom HaShabbat without zachor Sheshet Yemei Bria. Like there's a Shabbat only if you think of the 6 days of creation. With all that entails about thinking about creation and caring for Earth. Right.
Shabbat is a time to remember back to those days of creation and what the planet may have been like then, and what humankind was like in the dawning of civilization, or the dawning of the Jewish people, and then obviously you can take the Shabbat of here and this is one of the areas where the Torah just lobs a soft one over the plate for us, which is the Shemitah year, the idea of a Sabbath for the land and Sabbaths for our crops, and being conscious of how we, even in a agricultural society, there's a lot of rich stuff to work with there. I'm going to pause us here because we got 5 more minutes and I want to wrap up the session. And I hope what I've given you is a taste of what there is. We have barely dipped our pinky toes into the ocean of Torah with this new, oh gosh, I'll keep the metaphor going, with this new bathing suit on of the Anthropocene Torah. And even with just these 10 commandments, if we had taken out if we were in I wish we were in a Beit Midrash together. If we were in a Beit Midrash together and we took out our Chumashim and we really read the verses of the 10 commandments and we had hours to pour over them, I think we would have so much depths to explore. And this is really just, I hope I'm pointing people in a direction that's worth considering looking into further. On the next slide, it's just it's my first call to action. There's actually a few calls to action here, but I want you to think, well, go back, Yana, thank you. I want you to think about what you're going to add to this body of Torah, and what ways that you can take this idea into your future Torah study. And I want to emphasize the last note for the session that I want to emphasize is, I think it goes both ways. It's, what do traditional Torah ideas and Torah interpretations have to speak to the world we're living in, the times we're living in? And also, what do the times we're living in have to do to speak to the Torah that we're studying? And that back and forth relationship, I think, has a lot to be mined. David's suggesting a link to neohasid.org, which I can't vouch for, but David does. Oh, it's David's website. Okay, David definitely vouches for it. Check it out. And I guess if anyone else wants to plug anything in the chat, go ahead. If you're teaching a session later on or anything like that, feel free to plug in the chat. And let's go to the next and I think final slide. And that's just, we've been asked as part of the Big Jewish Climate Fest to encourage people to think of their own personal actions that they're going to take afterwards. This session was framed in Torah study. This session was framed in mental and emotional and spiritual adaptation to the world we live in and the world we're probably going to be living in over the coming decades and centuries. And that's one area of action that I want to encourage you to think about, which is, how can this speak to you and speak to others, and maybe sharing these ideas can be helpful. But there are also lots of other actions to consider taking. We mentioned at the beginning the personal and national level actions that people can take in order to help address and fight and combat climate change. Visit the website. There are actions there to take. Someone mentioned that Chazon has I think a 6-week challenge somewhere on their website, so you can sign up for a 6-week challenge to do a certain action and maybe develop a habit. That's all I have. If anyone has any additional comments or thoughts they want to share, I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer. But I want to thank you all for coming to study with me for the last hour or so, and I wish you all a happy Tu B'Shvat.